It's broken again. Good. The quiet satisfaction in the German whisper was a betrayal. The wind came dry and hot across the wire, carrying the scent of dust from the distant cotton fields and the faint, clean smell of soap from the barracks. The global war was finally over, but here at Camp Hearn, the mechanical, tedious routines of captivity had not stopped. Roll call, inspections, the dead, oppressive silence. In the small, separate compound designated for the German women, one thing alone shattered that silence, a sound like glass, reluctantly surrendering to heat. The long bathroom mirror had cracked again. The women had watched the fracture slowly spread for weeks, a jagged, unpredictable web radiating from corner to corner. They had meticulously taped the surface together with meager ration paper, using small, carefully smoothed scraps of labels from precious Red Cross parcels. The glass still showed their faces, but horribly twisted noses pulled sideways, eyes warped, expressions broken clean in half. They continued to use it anyway, clinging to the belief that even a distorted, broken reflection was infinitely better than none at all. That morning, a guard appeared at the doorway with his omnipresent clipboard. Behind him stood a man in dust-caked boots, his fatigue shirt sleeves rolled up, a heavy leather tool belt slung low, a belt that clearly had seen more horses than hammers. Maintenance, the guard announced simply. The man's name was Corporal Abe Lincoln, an ex-cowboy from Abilene, reluctantly drafted late, now serving as the camp's all-purpose handyman. The German prisoners, with typical precision, had already dubbed him Der Cowboy. The women inside the barracks instantly froze. Some deliberately turned their backs. Others frantically tried to cover their hair. Abe didn't seem to notice their panic. He knelt, assessed the spiderweb crack, and said quietly, his voice dry as the air, "Glass got tired of this heat." He pulled the old cracked mirror cleanly off the wall. The sudden, ripping sound made every woman flinch. He worked without talking, his movements economical and practiced. He cleaned the filthy frame, replaced the fragile backing board, and carefully fitted a single, flawless new pane of glass. A few women whispered among themselves in low German words of desperate caution, rising fear, and profound embarrassment. One whispered, "He'll leave fingerprints." Another warned, "Don't look when he's done." Abe finished his work, hung the new mirror securely, wiped the glass until it was utterly clean, and stepped back. The flawless surface instantly caught the bright morning light, shining sharp, perfect, almost brutally honest. "There," he said, tipping his hat, "good as new." No one moved. No one offered thanks. He waited a beat, then simply shrugged, tipped his hat again, and walked away. The women remained stock still. The mirror shone like a direct accusation. For the first time in months, they could see themselves with chilling clarity, faces that had filled out from steady American rations, cheeks that had regained a healthy color, hair that was clean and nourished, but none of them dared to step forward. Elsa Richter, the former Red Cross nurse, whispered, her voice frail, "It doesn't look like us." A woman standing nearby replied, her voice filled with sudden dread, "That's because it does." The barrack stayed submerged in a heavy, horrified silence. The mirror caught every flicker of light, every restless breath, every subtle tremor of fear. By evening, someone had silently draped a rough towel completely over it. Abe passed by the window later, saw the towel, and shook his head with a small private sigh. Guess they didn't like what they saw. The camp settled into the soft Texas dusk. The guards played a quiet game of cards by the main gate. The sky turned a fierce, bloody red above the wire, and inside Barracks 3, a single flawless mirror waited, covered by a shroud, waiting for eyes that simply could not bear to meet their own reflections. When the lights went out, no one uncovered it. They had survived the global war, but they had not survived the simple act of reflection. Before the mirror was fixed, before the towel was hung, the women had already built a functioning world inside their profound silence. They had quietly dubbed themselves unsichtbar, invisible. It felt safer that way. They meticulously followed every order. They managed to offer brittle, compliant smiles when they were watched. And they never, ever willingly met the eyes of the guards. They believed that this rigid invisibility was their last remaining form of dignity. The rumors that had traveled across the ocean with them claimed that American soldiers were filled with hate. The Reich's last desperate broadcasts had promised humiliation. The enemy will strip you of honor and force you to confess. But no one had stripped them. No one had forced any confession. Instead, the Americans ran the camp with the cold, relentless precision of a schedule. Clean, cold, utterly predictable. That frightened the women more than any expected cruelty ever could. They had braced for vengeance. They got methodical indifference. To the guards, these women were still the enemy, but a distant, seemingly harmless one. They looked quiet, compliant, almost harmless in their grey fatigues and neatly tied-back hair. The camp staff sometimes joked that they were housebroken Nazis. The Americans, in their immense, naive decency, assumed the women felt no guilt, that they were still fiercely proud of what their nation had done. They weren't. They were just quiet. Among themselves, in low, tight whispers, they spoke of what they had seen and what they had desperately chosen to ignore. Trains that never returned, cruel orders signed without question, the thin, telltale smoke that always followed. They had been integral parts of a monstrous system that relentlessly rewarded blind obedience. And now, that same rote obedience was the only thing keeping them alive. So, when the cowboy arrived to fix the mirror, they didn't see a simple man with a wrench. They saw a terrifying threat to their hard-won invisibility, a stranger who might force them to confront the devastating, moral ruin the war had left behind. The Americans assumed these women were unrepentant. The women assumed the Americans were lurking, watching for a single sign of weakness. Both sides were fundamentally wrong. The guards were simply doing their required, tedious jobs. The women were actively trying not to remember. When the mirror was replaced, that fragile, tense balance shattered instantly. Reflection was a personal confrontation they hadn't faced since before the surrender. The old, cracked glass had offered them protection. It made every face look fractured, every detail softened, generously forgiven by the distortion. The new, flawless glass, however, offered no mercy. It showed the chilling truth. They looked terrifyingly alive again, well-fed, clean, younger. They looked exactly like people who had survived something they weren't entirely sure they deserved to survive. One guard, observing the bizarre tableau from the doorway, muttered, "They act like that mirror is a firing squad." Another replied, his voice low and thoughtful, "Maybe it is." That night, as the women carefully covered the mirror with the towel, Greta Moore, the former Red Cross nurse, said softly, "We lived through the end of the world. Why would we possibly want to see what came after?" In the morning, Abe noticed the towel again and thought nothing of it. For him, it was just a mirror, a fixed utility. For them, it was something entirely different, a reflective surface that instantly turned mundane military order into raw, piercing memory. He did not understand their profound silence. They did not understand his unbidden kindness. He fixed things. They hid from what was fixed. Both sides fundamentally believed the other was missing something essentially human. The guards thought the women were heartless automatons. The women thought the guards were soulless machines. Neither realized that what they were both truly afraid of was the exact same thing, seeing too clearly. The Americans measured war by what could be efficiently repaired. The Germans measured it by what definitively couldn't be. When the mirror was returned to cold perfection, neither side was ready for the moral confrontation that reflection demanded. And beneath the thin, rough towel, the flawless glass silently waited. By the autumn of 1945, Texas was full of ghosts in olive-drab uniform. The war had ended months before, but its massive administrative machinery was still running, powered now entirely by endless forms, strict schedules, and an uncomfortable silence. Across 46 states, the United States held approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war, and only a tiny fraction, barely 2,500, were women. Most were not soldiers in the rigid sense. They had been nurses, typists, radio operators, bureaucrats in uniform, witnesses with relatively clean hands and profoundly dirty memories. Camp Hearn was one of the oldest of these camps. Neat rows of symmetrical barracks, intimidating guard towers watching from each corner, the constant smell of diesel and cotton dust mixing with the faint, medicinal sweetness of Red Cross soap. The U.S. Army's Prisoner of War Service Command officially called it a low-risk containment site. To the women inside, it was merely a temporary waiting room for history's inevitable judgment. The female section of the camp had been added: hastily wooden walls, tin roofs, a dedicated mess hall, a laundry shed, a small chapel, and one long communal bathroom, featuring the one cracked mirror above a row of stainless steel sinks. That was where the anxious lines always formed, mornings and evenings, faces bowed, eyes resolutely averted. Among them was Greta Moore, 25. Once a German Red Cross nurse, she had joined the service in 1941, believing fiercely in duty, not in ideology. She had stitched wounds, helped bury friends, and crucially, she had always obeyed orders. When she was captured by advancing American forces in France, she had fully expected harsh interrogation and brutal punishment. Instead, she was efficiently tagged, processed, and shipped across the entire Atlantic to Texas, with virtually no questions asked. The sheer absence of accusation unsettled her far more deeply than any guilt ever could. The camp handyman, Corporal Abe Lincoln, wasn't a soldier anymore, at least not in spirit. He'd been a working ranch hand before the war, drafted into a job fixing whatever broke: plumbing, electrical wiring, fences, light fixtures. The army trusted him with hammers, not with state secrets. He wore his fatigue shirt open at the neck and a wide-brimmed hat whenever he could get away with it. He called the other guards city boys and the prisoners folks. His job took him everywhere: the men's compound, the motor pool, the kitchens, and sometimes the women's wing. The first time he walked through their gate, they stared at him as if he had stepped out of a movie screen. To them, he was the American myth, a cowboy who simply did not belong to this terrible war. To him, they were just another collection of broken things the army expected him to maintain. The cracked mirror was one of dozens of mundane repair orders. The camp's pervasive humidity warped the glass, the heat cracked the frames, and the women's barracks had notoriously the worst plumbing in the entire district. The guards had logged the request: replacement mirror, lavatory, glass, Type B12, 1 per 60 inmates. Abe Turner wrote beside it, replace entire piece, a frame split. He didn't give it a second thought. But for Greta, the mirror had become an unexpected, integral part of her internal world. Every morning she looked into its intentional distortion, deeply grateful that the crack blurred her reflection. It served as a constant, subtle reminder that she wasn't whole, that the past was still profoundly broken. The mirror made it much easier not to see the terrifying difference between the bright-eyed girl she had been and the complicit woman she had become. When the American came to fix it, her entire world shifted. Behind the story of the mirror was the vast, unseen machinery that made it possible. The U.S. Army Prisoner of War Service Command issued every item by number: mirror, lavatory, glass, Type B, 12. 1 per 60 inmates. A replacement was just a routine, bureaucratic task: paperwork, inventory, regulation. But in war, even the most routine things grow teeth. For the Americans, replacing the mirror meant order restored. For the women, it meant reflection returned. They were living in a system where decency was rigidly standardized: 3,000 calories per day, 8 hours of regulated labor, 2 full showers per week, and a zero-tolerance policy for abuse. The rules protected them, yet they also subtly stripped them of all personal identity. The irony was perfect. A nation that had proudly built its identity on the cornerstone of obedience was now being rigorously forced to live under someone else's superior version of it. Greta once wrote in her small notebook, "The Americans build fences out of kindness. We built ours out of pride. Theirs hold better." When Abe showed up with his flawless glass and heavy tools, he had no idea that the object he was carrying wasn't just a mirror. It was a terrifying, pitiless window into what guilt truly looks like when no one dares to name it. Every morning at Camp Hearn began with arithmetic: 3,000 calories per prisoner, 42 gallons of water per barrack, 8 hours of work, 2 showers a week. The war had efficiently turned morality into simple logistics, and America had perfected it. Even decency was calculated in rations and ounces of soap. The camp ledger read like a precise equation of civilization. 425,000, German POWs, 2,000, 500 of them women, spread across 511 camps in 46 states. The female wing at Hearn was one of the smallest 60 women guarded by 18 men, overseen by one sergeant who believed that order was mercy. They were all mere numbers now, and the numbers worked. Disease rates fell by 90% in 3 months. Escape attempts were 0. Malnutrition was non-existent. Every prisoner was logged, weighed, and filed into a system that cared, not out of emotional compassion, but out of cold precision. The United States had built a vast, functioning factory of decency. The guards didn't need anger. They had detailed paperwork. But there was one crucial thing no ledger could ever account for: memory. The women were visibly gaining weight, their skin cleared. They laughed quietly during work shifts. The mirror, when it was cracked, successfully hid those changes. It allowed them to see fragments, to remain victims in their own internal eyes. But now, with the new, flawless glass shining sharp as a blade, they could see everything. And everything looked wrong. Their faces didn't look like defeated prisoners. They looked like survivors of a world that was still burning somewhere else. The palpable softness returning to their cheeks utterly mocked the ruins they had left behind. Greta noticed it first. She washed her face at the sink and looked up, fully expecting the same distorted, fractured face she'd known for months. Instead, she saw herself exactly as she used to look: clean, well-fed, almost unnervingly peaceful. Her breath caught in her throat. "It's not right," she whispered. "We shouldn't look this alive." Behind her, another woman muttered, "They feed us better than they feed our own soldiers." Another replied, her voice empty, "That's because we've already lost." The mirror instantly began to change the camp's rhythm. Fewer women lingered in the washroom. They stopped combing their hair in front of it. They washed quickly, their eyes resolutely downcast. Some covered the glass with towels. Others tried to scratch its surface to dull the blinding shine. The Americans didn't understand. To them, reflection meant normality. To the prisoners, it meant guilt. Abe Turner saw the towel one morning and laughed softly. "Guess they don't like seeing pretty." He didn't mean any harm. He couldn't possibly know that the towel was a shroud. For the women, the mirror was not about vanity. It was about truth. It reminded them that they were still human in a world that no longer wanted them to be. The camp report officially stated, "Hygiene morale is high." The unspoken truth was the direct opposite. Cleanliness had made them agonizingly aware of what they'd been a willing part of. They looked undeniably healthy, but they couldn't stand the sight of themselves. The Americans kept writing numbers. The Germans kept covering the glass. One side measured progress by what could be fixed. The other measured guilt by what couldn't. One repaired mirror, 60 avoided glances, 0 explanations. That was the grim math of reflection. It didn't belong in the official reports, but it haunted the very air inside the barracks. The quiet, devastating proof that survival itself can feel like accusation. Not cruelty, but consequence. Not punishment, but precision. Not fear of the armed guard, but fear of the flawless glass. When a nation finally rebuilds its conscience, it must begin with what it resolutely refuses to see. And in that Texas camp, cold, systematic decency had achieved what brutal cruelty could not. It had forced them to face themselves. Corporal Abe Lincoln arrived with his trusty toolkit slung over his shoulder, the distinct sound of metal rattling on leather marking his inevitable steps. The women now knew the routine by heart. Every few weeks, something broke, and a cowboy came to fix it. He had never harmed anyone, never once shouted, never lingered unnecessarily. But his quiet, masculine presence instantly changed the air, a constant reminder that men still existed, that the species that gave the terrible orders hadn't been erased by the war. That morning, the sergeant pointed to the bathroom door again. "That mirror's loose. Check the bolts." Abe nodded and walked in. The women froze mid-task, washing, scrubbing, folding towels. They seemed to stop breathing the moment he stepped through the door. He tipped his hat, a reflex, then crouched by the sink. The room smelled sharply of soap and suppressed fear. The mirror hung there, spotless, but covered halfway by the familiar towel. Abe peeled it back and stared briefly at his own reflection. He saw a sunburned, weary man, deep lines etched at the corners of his eyes, sweat darkening his collar. He wiped the glass and muttered, "Hell, it's cleaner than mine back home." Behind him, Elsa Richter whispered in German, "He looks at it like it's nothing." Another woman answered, "Because it is nothing to him." He felt their eyes on him, intense and unnerving, but he didn't turn. He worked quietly, tightening the bolts, rechecking the frame, humming something low and steady, a slow cowboy tune, patient as dust. When he finished, he said, without looking up, "There, good as new again." No one moved. No one thanked him. He looked up at them, genuinely puzzled. "You folks hate mirrors or something?" Greta finally spoke, struggling with the foreign language. "We don't need them." Abe frowned. "Everyone needs them. Can't shave without one." The women offered no response. The silence pressed down until even the rhythmic dripping of the faucet seemed deafeningly loud. He shrugged, wiped his hands on his trousers, and left. When the door closed, Greta stepped forward. Her reflection stared back at her calm, flawless, and merciless. The glass did not distort, did not lie. It showed everything she had desperately tried to forget: the clean skin, the neat hair, the terrifying absence of fear. She touched her face and whispered, "We look human again, and that's the problem." That night, a few women quietly returned after the official lights out. The bathroom was dark, except for the moonlight spilling through the narrow slats of the window. They gathered around the mirror as if they were performing a vigil around a grave. One of them, trembling, lifted the towel, stared at her own reflection, and instantly broke. Her dry sobs echoed off the tile walls. "I don't know who this is," she wept. Another replied, her voice heavy with shared despair, "It's who we were supposed to be before we followed orders." They stood in agonizing silence, each woman seeing not a simple face, but a personal verdict. The next morning, the towel was back over the mirror. When Abe came by later, he noticed it again. "Strange folks," he muttered. He didn't bother to report it. To him, it was a harmless quirk. To them, it was a necessary purgatory. Days passed, and the mirror stayed hidden. The women moved through their routines, washing, eating, working without ever meeting their reflections. It became a kind of camp superstition. Whoever looked too long at the mirror would dream of the terrible past. Greta dreamed often. She saw the bombed hospital in Metz, the wounded crying out for morphine, the callous officer telling her to save the precious drugs only for the pilots. She saw the bombs falling and the sickening reflection of fire on glass. Every dream ended the exact same way, with her own clean, unforgiving face looking back from the cracked mirror. She began to actively avoid the washroom altogether. One evening, she found Abe fixing a loose door near the laundry shed. She stopped, struggling to find the precise English words. "Why do you fix things that will break again?" she asked him. He looked up, genuinely confused. "Because that's the job, ma'am." She nodded slowly. "That's what we used to say." Then she simply walked away. That night, Abe thought about her words while eating supper with the other guards. "Those girls don't need fences," he said. "They're locked in their own heads." The sergeant shrugged. "Let 'em be. They're quiet." But Abe couldn't shake the unsettling thought. The mirror he had perfectly fixed had become something else, a thing no one wanted, but no one could bring themselves to destroy. In his maintenance logbook, he wrote one cryptic line: "Repaired mirror twice, still not used." For him, it was an oddity. For them, it was purgatory made of glass. The mirror did not break again. That was the central, defining problem. For months, it stayed there on the wall, flawless, clear, and cold. The towel remained draped over it, then removed, then replaced. Like a fragile flag no one wanted to salute, it became a permanent part of the camp's quiet math. One mirror, 60 women, 0 reflections. Major Sterling's weekly report mentioned everything that mattered to the U.S. Army. Rations, labor output, incident logs, hygiene facilities. Functional, he wrote. Morale stable. The paperwork, efficient as it was, did not see the silence. It did not see what the women studiously avoided. It could not measure the crushing weight of guilt. Inside the barracks, something vital started to erode. The longer the women lived, the clearer the mirror became, and the less they could bear to face it. They were eating well. They were perfectly safe. They were treated entirely by the book. But every comfort they received only sharpened the agonizing contrast with what they remembered. Each new sign of health was its own private indictment. Smooth skin meant they hadn't died like the civilians they'd passed on the road. Full stomachs meant they'd been spared when others starved. The mirror did not lie. It simply showed that survival had a price. Greta tried to reason with herself. "It's only glass," she whispered. But she couldn't look at it. She washed her face entirely by feel, turned her back while combing her hair, and dressed without checking alignment. The reflection had become unbearable precisely because it showed no visible stain. Her friend Elsa said, "They cleaned us on the outside, so the dirt inside shines brighter." Abe Turner saw none of this internal agony. To him, the camp ran perfectly. He logged maintenance, fixed light bulbs, patched pipes. When he passed the women's wing, he nodded politely and moved on. Sometimes he caught their eyes brief, startled, distant, and thought they looked more like patients than prisoners. One afternoon, he found Greta sitting alone outside the laundry building. She was staring fixedly at her own hands. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, I just don't know whose hands these are." Abe frowned. "Pretty sure they're yours." She smiled faintly. "Not anymore." He didn't understand, and she didn't explain. He tipped his hat and left. That night, she opened her small notebook and wrote, "When I was hungry, I felt human. When I am clean, I feel like a ghost." The next morning, she covered the mirror with the towel again. By December, the guards noticed the women were quieter, slower, less responsive. No riots, no open defiance, just the sound of work without voices. One sergeant joked, "They're turning into shadows." But shadows still reflect light. These women had gone past that. The system kept working. 3,000 calories, 8 hours of labor, weekly inspections, everything precise, humane, effective. Yet inside that cold perfection, the prisoner spirit sank below the measurable numbers. The more orderly the camp became, the less alive they felt. Greta wrote again, "We are well fed, well kept, and unwell." The Americans measured progress in statistics. The Germans measured it in silence. Abe saw it once. Early morning, frost on the window, light catching the mirror's surface. For a second, he saw faces behind him in the glass, blurred, ghost-like, watching him without expression. He turned. The room was utterly empty. He rubbed his tired eyes, muttering, "Hell of a place." He wrote another line in his log, "Mirror still fine." For the U.S. Army, that meant success. For the women, it meant collapse. They had survived war, hunger, and loss. But they couldn't survive reflection. In the end, nothing structurally broke, not the glass, not the rules, not the system, only the people inside it. And when mercy becomes mechanical, even kindness can crush. January 1946. The winter sun was pale and cold over the Texas plains. The frost on the barrack roofs melted slowly, dripping down the wood like sweat. Inside, the air smelled of soap and stale bread. The camp was quiet. Too quiet, one Red Cross inspector noted in her report. "The women's section," she wrote, "functions perfectly. It also feels dead." That day, a nurse from the Red Cross medical team made her routine visit. She was American, 30 years old, polite but direct. Her clipboard carried questions that could fit on a postage stamp. Weight, temperature, appetite, morale. She went down the line of prisoners, asking each one the same thing. "Are you feeling better?" When she reached Greta Moore, the German nurse, she paused. "You look healthy now," she said gently. "That's good." Greta looked at her hands again, the same way she had in the laundry. "That's what frightens me," she said quietly. The nurse didn't understand. "You should be glad," Greta replied. "Healthy people are supposed to feel alive." Then she simply turned away. The nurse wrote something on her clipboard and moved on. After the inspection, Greta went to the bathroom. The towel had slipped off the mirror overnight, revealing the full sheet of flawless glass. She stood before it, unable to move. Her reflection looked back at her face fuller, eyes calmer. skin glowing with health. It was the same face she'd seen in the hospital at Metz before the bombing, before she'd stopped believing in anything but rote duty. She remembered washing blood off her hands, the specific orders to leave civilians outside triage the day she stopped asking names. Now that same face stared back, unscarred. That was what she couldn't bear. She whispered, "This face does not deserve peace." Behind her, 2 other women came in, instantly froze, and looked at the mirror, too. They said nothing. The silence pressed heavy on all of them. Abe Turner passed the open door a few minutes later and saw them standing there like statues. He hesitated, hat in his hands, then kept walking. He knew the difference between broken things and things you absolutely shouldn't touch. Later that week, the Red Cross nurse filed her report. It read, "Clean facilities, adequate diet, medical conditions, excellent. Psychological conditions, uncertain." In the margin, she added, "They seem afraid of recovery." The camp's cold efficiency continued. Work assignments met quota, inspections passed, discipline held. But under the surface, the women were slowly, internally unraveling. They had been rebuilt too well. One evening, Greta wrote in her notebook, "The Americans fixed the mirror. We cannot fix what we see in it." She tried to explain it to Elsa later that night. "When we looked broken, we still belonged to the world that was burning. Now we look normal, but the world is still in ashes. That is worse." Elsa didn't argue. She just nodded and said, "Then we won't look anymore." The next morning, the towel was pinned tightly over the mirror again, meticulously sealed like a surgical wound. For the Americans, that towel meant nothing. For the women, it meant survival. Abe stopped by that day to check a light fixture. He noticed the towel again and laughed softly. "Still shy," he muttered. Greta heard him and said, her voice strained, "It's not shyness, it's memory." He didn't know what that meant, but for her, it was the truest thing she'd ever said. By February, every woman in Barracks 3 could move through her morning routine without ever looking up. Their actions had become pure muscle memory. Soap, water, towel, walk away. They didn't need the mirror anymore. They carried what it showed inside their minds. To the guards, they were model prisoners. To history, they were a study in silence. February 1946. Another cold morning. Another convoy of trucks crawling into Camp Hearn. This time they brought 30 new prisoners, transferred from a camp in Oklahoma, mostly clerks and typists from the collapsing German administrative corps. Among them was Irma Klaus, 32, a logistics officer who had once worked for a supply unit outside Kassel. Her hands were calloused from typewriter keys. Her mind still ran on inventory and procedure. When she stepped into the women's barrack, she noticed 2 things immediately: the profound silence and the covered mirror. "Why is the mirror covered?" she asked in German. No one answered. A woman folding sheets said only, "You'll understand soon." The Americans processed her the same way they had processed everyone else. Delousing, medical check, new clothes. She ate her first warm meal in months and almost wept. "You treat us like people," she told a guard. He shrugged. "It's just the rules." Days passed, and Irma noticed that something in the camp's efficiency felt eerily familiar. The schedules, the meticulous records, the cold precision. It was the same rhythm she'd lived under in Germany. Only now, it wasn't fear that drove it. It was cold habit. She realized the Americans had done what her own country couldn't. They'd made order feel safe. One night, she walked into the bathroom and decisively pulled the towel from the mirror. The glass was spotless, so clean it looked like water. She stared at herself for the first time since the surrender. Her reflection was not what she expected. She didn't see the officer who had once signed requisitions for mass train shipments. She saw a woman who had meticulously obeyed every line, every stamp, every order that made the war possible. She whispered, "This is the face that made everything run." She remembered the forms, how she'd written numbers that weren't men, but people, how she'd balanced columns without ever asking where the supplies were going. The mirror didn't forgive. It showed a face untouched by smoke or ash, a civilian face in a soldier's system. Later that night, Irma went to the chapel and asked the American chaplain if confession was allowed for prisoners. He said gently, "If you believe in forgiveness, it's allowed anywhere." She smiled faintly. "I don't." That's why I need it. The next day, she told Greta, asterisk asterisk, we built a nation that worshipped order. Now we live in a country that uses it kindly. I think that's worse. Greta understood instantly. She said, they make mercy feel like discipline. By March, Irma had begun helping the Americans as a translator for supply lists. She found the irony almost unbearable. Back to counting boxes and tracking inventory, this time for her captors. When Abe Turner passed through the office, she told him, you fix glass, I fix mistakes, we both fail. He smiled, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. A week later, she caught her own reflection again, this time in a bucket of water. The distorted image looked kinder than the real one. She whispered, that's better. The camp report showed no issues. Food, supplies, morale, steady. The mirror didn't appear in any document. When Red Cross inspectors visited in late March, Irma stayed carefully out of sight. She didn't want anyone to see her looking away from the glass. The inspector noted, discipline admirable, spirits subdued but cooperative. Before leaving, the inspector asked, Abe, any problems with the women's compound? He thought for a moment, then said, just one. They don't use mirrors. The inspector smiled. Vanity is gone then. That's progress. Abe didn't reply. He knew it wasn't vanity. It was the crushing opposite. It was self-erasure. That night, he walked past the barracks. The faint light from the bathroom window spilled into the yard. The mirror was uncovered, catching a strip of moonlight. For a moment, he saw movement inside, shadows shifting, faces glancing at the glass, then quickly turning away. He stood there, hat in hand, and muttered to himself, guess they see something we don't. And he was right. What they saw was not reflection. It was revelation. The war was over. The world had moved on. But in that mirror, time had horrifyingly stopped. April 1946. The Texas wind turned warm again, and the fields around Camp Hearn began to bloom. Cotton buds, wild grass, and the slow, gentle return of color to a world that had spent too long in existential gray. The war was rapidly fading from conversation, replaced by talk of plans, of crops, of baseball. Only inside the barbed wire did it still linger, an invisible, suffocating fog no sun could burn away. The women were thinner now, not from hunger, but from the immense weight they carried inside. Their physical health was perfect. Their hearts were unbearably heavy. The mirror remained exactly where Abe had fixed it months before, still shining, still unused. To the Americans, the camp was a success story. No disease, no violence, no escapes. Order had triumphed, but order cannot heal what it only contains. Abe Turner passed the women's compound one morning with his clipboard. He saw the mirror again through the open door, uncovered, untouched, catching the light just so. He thought about how bizarre it was that the only thing in this entire place that stayed perfect was the one thing nobody wanted. He asked Greta, you ever look at it? She shook her head. It shows too much. Too much what? Too much that isn't broken. Abe said nothing. He wasn't a man for words. He just nodded and left, writing one last final note in his maintenance log. Mirror secure. Condition unchanged. That was the last entry ever made about the women's barracks. The official history of Camp Hearn would never mention the mirror. It would talk about the food, the inspections, the Red Cross visits, the zero escape attempts. It would celebrate the system. But systems don't write the truth. People do, and people often forget what hurts too deeply. Inside the barracks, the towel stayed off now. Not because the women had accepted their reflections, but because they had learned to look without seeing. They brushed their hair, washed their faces, passed the mirror without stopping. It had become background, part of the static structure, like the walls, the sinks, the silence. Greta's last diary entry was one short sentence. They gave us glass and called it mercy. When the official release orders came in June, no one cheered. They packed quietly, folded their uniforms, and lined up by the trucks. As they left, Irma looked back once at the building. She caught the sunlight glancing off the mirror inside and turned away quickly. Later, on the ship bound for Germany, she told Greta, "I don't think I can look at another mirror again." Greta replied, "Then don't. Just remember what you saw when you tried. That was their internal verdict. Not from a tribunal, not from a judge, but from themselves. They had survived, but survival had a reflection, and they couldn't bear it. Not hate, but habit had sustained them. Not cruelty, but civility had condemned them. Not punishment, but reflection had destroyed them. The war had ended with treaties and flags, but in Texas, it ended with a piece of glass, still silent, waiting a mirror that showed no blood, no smoke, no flames, only faces desperately trying to believe they belonged to the living. When the last transport rolled away, Abe stood outside the empty barrack and looked through the window. The mirror caught his image this time. One man, one reflection, alone in a room built to contain memory. He whispered to himself, "Guess it never needed fixing after all." And as the wind lifted through the open door, the towel fluttered once, fell to the floor, and stayed there. The mirror was bare again, and the faces it had once shown were gone, leaving only their silence behind. June 1946. Camp Hearn was empty. The barracks stood in neat rows beneath the Texas sun, their doors open, their beds stripped bare. The noise of trucks and orders had vanished. All that remained was the wind and the sound of wood creaking in the heat. The war had finally ended here, months after the last shot in Europe. In the women's compound, the mirror still hung above the row of sinks, clean, perfectly intact, a small thing that had survived without a crack. The same flawless glass that once frightened 60 prisoners now reflected nothing but the empty light. Abe Turner came back one last time to close out his work orders. He walked through the barracks, touching the walls he had once repaired, the floors he had swept, the light fixtures he had meticulously tightened. When he reached the bathroom, he stopped. The sunlight caught the mirror, blinding and perfect. He stared at his own reflection, a little older, a little grayer, his eyes tired. He thought of the women who had stood there, afraid to look. He whispered, "Guess I never fixed what mattered." He took off his hat and wiped the dust from the glass with his sleeve. For a second, it felt like the mirror was watching him back. Outside, a Red Cross officer waited with a clipboard. "You're clear, Turner. Camp's closed." Abe nodded. "This place will forget itself soon enough." The officer smiled. "It's just another file now." But the mirror stayed. For years after, locals would visit the abandoned camp, walking through the ruins of barracks, where grass grew through the floorboards. Some swore that when you stood in that bathroom, even decades later, you could feel the quiet like the air still remembered the crushing weight of what was never said. No one ever took the mirror down. No one broke it. It just hung there, waiting. They said the women were treated humanely. They were. They said the Americans were merciful. They were. But mercy has a cost, and in that camp, it was paid in silence. They came as enemies and left as reflections. They were fed, clothed, healed, and haunted. The mirror never cracked again because it didn't need to. The fracture had moved entirely inside them. And as the years turned the camp to dust, that glass remained the last survivor of a war that was supposed to be over. They feared cruelty and found order. They feared punishment and found pity. But what they feared most was the terrible truth that mercy reveals. That sometimes the hardest thing to face after war is your own face. What other quiet moral battles might have been fought inside the walls of Camp Hearn during those long months after the surrender?